Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is Massachusetts TNC's webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, and influencers and our partners from New England and around the world. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm Massachusetts State Director and your host, Deb Markowitz. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthy world for all. We work locally and globally, using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and the planet. So to that end, we've got an exciting program for you today. We're going to be chatting with Karen Lombard, Massachusetts TNC's Director of Stewardship and Restoration, and Markelle Smith, our Landscape Partnership Manager, who's been with us for many years now working in the landscape. Karen and Markelle will tell us about how they've recently rewilded an important plot of land near Coles Brook, which is a tributary to the Westfield River. They're going to talk about rewilding as a restoration strategy and how they went about removing a house that fragmented the landscape. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about our guests. Karen Lombard oversees TNC's preserve, stewardship, legal and fee monitoring, and terrestrial restoration projects in Massachusetts. That means whenever we get a conservation piece of conservation land, we need to make sure that it's being conserved according to the agreement and according to the laws that govern conservation. And then, of course, when we get land, often we need to restore it so that it's in ecological health and doing the work we want it to be doing on the landscape. Karen received her BA in Biology and Environmental Studies from Williams College and her Master's of Science in Conservation Biology from the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan. Markelle Smith is the Landscape Partnership Manager for TNC in Massachusetts. She manages land conservation projects, leveraging funding and facilitating partnerships with land trusts and state and federal agencies. Her goal is to ensure that the most resilient lands in the state are protected. She also chairs the Friends of the Conti National Fish and Wildlife Refuge. Markelle received her BS in terrestrial ecology from the University of Vermont and holds a Master of Forestry from Yale's University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I want to say, if you think of questions for Karen and Markelle during their presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Thanks so much for joining us again today, and let's dive in. Markelle and Karen.
Okay. Everyone can hear me? All right. So just as Deb mentioned, we want to share an exciting story today where we are restoring or rewilding one of our preserves in Western Massachusetts, and also put it in the larger context of both rewilding and protection efforts within the Appalachians. So first of all, what is rewilding? Rewilding activities are conservation efforts aimed at restoring and protecting natural processes and wilderness areas. The word rewilding was coined by Dave Foreman of the radical environmental group Earth First, and it first appeared in print in about 1990. It was further refined by conservation biologists Michael Soule and Reed Noss in a paper published in 1998. Rewilding was first thought of as a method to preserve functional ecosystems and reduce biodiversity loss, thinking about wilderness recovery on a grand scale. Ecological restoration at that time was focused on sites and not landscape scale systems. According to Soule and Noss, rewilding is a conservation method based on cores, corridors, and carnivores, which is about providing natural connections between protected areas and protecting or reintroducing apex predators and keystone species, creating a dynamic landscape. Next. While the term was not coined until the 1990s, aspects of this concept have had a long history in the US. Certainly our national parks were established with some of those concepts in mind. The Adirondack Park in 1892 has forever wildlands. The Wilderness Act in the 60s. And it continues to inspire new ideas, such as E.O. Wilson's Half Earth, and also the Biden administration's 30 by 30 goal, now known as America the Beautiful initiative, which is about protecting 30% of US lands and ocean territories by 2030. And it's really a global movement too. There's a group that actually comes out of India that has a global charter based on rewilding. And there's a number of projects in Europe as well. Next slide. The concept of rewilding, though, seems to be expanding, ironically, to include smaller scales. The meaning of the word is now reaching a larger public. There was a recent Boston Globe article on rewilding the Muddy River in the Back Bay Fens. There's lots of publicity out there and promotion of pollinator gardens and creating pollinator pathways across the landscape. And our own and other conservation organizations work even in developed landscapes, taking out dams, removing structures, and using nature-based solutions to help us solve climate challenges, which then make for more functional systems and provide support and connections for wildlife. Next. One could also argue that rewilding has become very relevant to us personally. There's lots of interest in rewilding ourselves. There's more and more evidence of the importance of nature for our physical and mental health. Certainly this past year during COVID, many of us have gotten solace and rejuvenation in nature. There's even a book out there called Rewilding COVID, although I don't think it's exactly this topic. I found that interesting. But we're talking about rewilding our gardens, by helping encourage native species. And there's also things such as forest bathing, where you can go and have a guided meditation in the woods that can be very good for your health. Next. What is interesting is that both in New England, it's very relevant at the site we'll be talking about today, that we are already living in a rewilding story. New England is a rewilding story. I got that term, that phrase from Tom Butler, who gave a presentation on rewilding at the Northeast Wilderness Trust recently. It's an unintentional rewilding, a reforestation of New England after people moved west in search of better agricultural land. We see it in our stone walls, crumbling mill and home foundations, and scars of old roads. And so maybe what we can call what we are doing now a second rewilding. Next. So what is the difference between rewilding and restoration? As I've mentioned above, rewilding began as a way to think about one particular aspect of restoration: large core land holdings, connections, and carnivores. Is rewilding an aspect of restoration? Is it essentially restoration? Is it more about animals than traditional terrestrial restoration? Is it more forward thinking? Some recent scientific papers have discussed this. One mentions that rewilding is more forward thinking. Restoration tends to think about restoring something that is lost. Another article criticizes the term. Rewilding is a fuzzy concept and lacks precise definition. It's really just a new, more exciting name for restoration. But I think there is something about this term that captures the imagination of us all in a way that restoration may not, especially when it includes us. Much of restoration does continue to require continued actions by humans to remove invasive species, to implement fire, to mimic natural processes that are no longer present. Rewilding is really about setting up a stage so that nature can fix itself and respond dynamically to changes. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and please share any thoughts in the chat and the Q&A. Next. Arguably, TNC has been about restoration since our beginning and the early land protection that we started. We started with protecting small parcels. We moved to protecting large landscapes in the 80s and 90s, and also started thinking about connections between landscapes. Here in Massachusetts, we have taken out dams, worked with partners to reintroduce fire to landscapes on the Cape and Islands in the 80s. We've worked on creating corridors for wildlife to move. And over the past 30 years, we've worked at larger and larger scales and initiated efforts to protect large blocks of forest. And as Markelle will share, we're thinking at the scale of the Appalachians. In Massachusetts, our first building removal was on a preserve in the Berkshires on our Cashin tract. This is in Egremont in 2016. This was a site where a house was practically in the river, not unlike this one. And the river was an important water supply for the town of Egremont. Today, we're going to share this wonderful story of our second building removal. And I'll turn it over to Markelle now.
Thank you, Karen. So we're going to zoom in a little bit here to our Coles Brook Preserve. So to locate us, we're here in the Massachusetts towns of Middlefield, Washington, and Becket, and that includes both Hampshire and Berkshire counties. A brief history of the creation of this TNC preserve. In 2005, the Nature Conservancy purchased the Weiss property, which on the map is the one that has what looks like a lake there. It's an impoundment. It's the damming of Coles Brook. And that parcel that surrounds that is the Weiss property. That's about 270 acres, and it's bordered, it borders both sides of the ecologically important Coles Brook. That was our first acquisition in the Westfield River watershed. And the land has since become a centerpiece for a corridor of protected land that we've been building in the 15 years since then. Our Coles Brook Preserve is now more than 1,500 acres, from its headwaters to its confluence with the west branch of the Westfield River. It's mostly forest land bordering Coles Brook. The preserve also links, and you can see it on this map, to Middlefield State Forest there to the east, and that's 3,400 acres. And that also is connected to 15,000 acres of a protected land, which is just a matrix of different ownerships. But it results in this excellent habitat for wide-ranging moose, bear, bobcat, and many other species. I would also like to acknowledge that the Coles Brook Preserve is located on the original homelands of the Pecumtuck and Mohican people. Next slide, please. So as you can see, this preserve is part of a larger network of climate resilient lands stretching from the central Appalachians north. And this is going to zoom out here. Hopefully the animation's working. So we're zooming out and you can see the forests of Western Mass, which are in this Berkshire wildlife linkage, which links the Hudson Highlands of New York up to the Green Mountains of Vermont. And then as we get further out, you can see the central Appalachians to the south there, linking all the way up to the northern Appalachians and up into Canada. So now more than ever, protecting these regional wildlife corridors are essential. They're important for wildlife passage and for carbon storage and for lots of other benefits they provide for people too, like clean air, water, and increasingly, as the pandemic has shown us, these areas are essential to people's well-being as they provide places to get out in nature. Next slide, please. So one of my favorite parts of what I do here at the Nature Conservancy is getting to know landowners whose land that we work to conserve. And this is a story of two of those people that we have the great privilege of working with, Susan Minnich and Roy Bryan. In the 1970s, both Susan and Roy worked and lived in New York City. He was a set designer for the Metropolitan Opera and she a labor organizer. In about 1980, after searching for a year or so for land to buy and visiting lots of properties that weren't quite right, either too close to development or on roads that were too busy, Susan found some land in Washington on Cross Place Road advertised in the New York Times. Washington and the specific site were perfect, close enough to cultural sites in the Berkshires, wild enough for hiking, skiing, and appreciating the animals and plants around them. At first, it started as a weekend and vacation getaway, but after taking trains to and from the city for a few years, Susan and Roy decided to build a house on their land and permanently relocate to Western Massachusetts. Using trees growing on their land and a portable sawmill borrowed from a neighbor, Roy and Susan milled the lumber for their house, and Roy's carpentry made the construction of their new home in the Berkshires a reality. They rebuilt the house twice, each time making it slightly larger and more modern and comfortable. They added solar electricity and running water. And over time, it transformed from a cabin, basically more like an Adirondack-style camp, to a small house with one of the most spectacular views of Coles Brook anywhere, flowing below and visible when washing dishes at the sink from their kitchen window. Along the way, they also purchased 2 abutting parcels. So now they started with 20 acres, but now own 60. They hiked in during this time about a mile each way to get to and from their house from the road. And they did this year round in all weather conditions. Eventually, after about 20 years, as they were getting older, they decided that the construction of a driveway made sense. And so they created a small driveway with a little bit of access that would allow them to get the flowers from Susan's cut flower business to local farmers markets. Our stories converge: the story of the building of the Coles Brook Preserve by the Nature Conservancy and Roy and Susan's story, because of our mutual affiliation with the Westfield River Wild and Scenic Committee. Roy served as the town representative on the committee, his town representative, and we regularly attended those meetings to meet members of the committee and the community and hear about all of their important projects in the watershed. So over many years, about hearing about these land conservation projects spearheaded by the Conservancy and our land trust partners, working in the Westfield River watershed, Susan and Roy decided that they too would like to conserve their land. They wanted to make sure that the wildlife who had been their neighbors for so many years had a safe place to live into the future. Next slide, please. So the 3 20-acre parcels that Roy and Susan own are shown here. The circle indicates where their house is located, and that's their home there. So the Conservancy doesn't normally purchase land with structures. We prefer to spend our limited financial resources on the protection of raw land. Usually, we would carve off a lot for sale containing the house and any other structures, and we would conserve the remaining ecologically important land, but exclude those improvements. In this case, after many extended discussions with our protection and stewardship teams, we determined that the best ecological outcome would be to rewild the land by removing the house. The house was located really close to the brook, as you can see in the photo here. And we also just thought that new construction, any kind of potential widening and paving of the driveway would really compromise the ecological integrity of the land and the preserve that we've been building. This was a tricky conclusion to come to, knowing that Roy and Susan had built their house and had been such excellent caretakers and stewards of their land for such a long time. So it was my job to approach them and ask whether they might be receptive to us removing their home. Incredibly, they said that they were open to this idea, and they liked knowing that the forest would regrow where their house that they had built had once stood. So in May of 2019, we closed on the 60-acre Bryan Minnich project, and I will stop here and let Karen talk about the decommissioning of the house and rewilding of the land.
So once Markelle and her team finishes a land protection deal, the properties are turned over to my team. We have 4 of us in Massachusetts that manage the Nature Conservancy's 10,000 acres of preserves and conservation restrictions in Massachusetts. So for this site, our first task was to work with a consultant as well as the Washington Conservation Commission to do the permitting for removal of the house because it was next to Coles Brook and it was covered by the Wetlands Protection Act. And also at the same time, we, as well as Roy and Susan, also tried to provide opportunities for folks to salvage as much as they were willing to take, including a greenhouse, parts of the house, and garden plantings, so that we didn't have to put as much in a landfill. We also added the removal of 2 more structures across Cross Place Road, 2 falling down cabins on an adjacent tract to be most efficient in the project. Eventually, in December of 2020, a contractor, Scott McKenzie, who also lives in the Berkshires, removed all the buildings over a 2-week period in December 2020. And this was kind of a race against time because there was a blizzard coming, and it was a slippery, narrow road, and you had to get heavy equipment in. So it was actually quite an operation. Scott was also did the permitting for this portion of the project, and filled a well on the property as well. You can see one of the cabins there on the left, and then the beginnings of the demolition of the house on the right. And now we have a couple videos to show you of the demolition. So you can see here the excavator just starting to take lights out of the house. Quite amazing to watch, because it was sort of like watching a large dinosaur take chunks out of things. But he would take chunks and then move them over, and eventually they had dump trucks on site that would take out the debris. And it was fairly slow going, and this part took a few days. And we have one more video. So now we're a little bit further along, a little more of the house is gone, maybe half of the front part of the house. And this operator is really quite skilled. He would move everything over really carefully into piles. So as I mentioned, the demolition was completed in December. So really the site has not quite started to rewild. So we're just very in the early stages, and I actually haven't been out there to see if anything started to grow at the site. But our really, what we envision our final step is to create a 2-mile loop trail on this tract. And also it will include an adjacent tract that we just protected, the Latham tract, which will allow the public to explore the site and to see Coles Brook and watch the site rewild. So with that, we're happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation, and a reminder, there's the Q&A tab at the bottom. Feel free to put in your questions. I just have to say, I was so taken by your thinking about this, Karen, thinking about rewilding ourselves. And that really resonated with me. I wonder if it's resonated with people who've watched this too. There is this tension. Is this just a pretty way to talk about restoration, what we've been doing all along, or is this truly a different concept? And I wondered, I know you spoke to this, I wondered, Markelle, you spend a lot of time on the land. Do you have a feeling about this as well? Is rewilding something fundamentally different? Is it just the same way to and a cooler way to talk about something we've been doing all along?
Yeah, well, I think, as I mentioned, there's a couple different kinds of restoration. So this is the kind where you take something out and then you let nature kind of take charge. I mean, we'll go in and we'll monitor to make sure there are no invasive species, right? But other than that, pretty much let things go back. But then we do other kinds of restoration work, like particularly out on Martha's Vineyard, where we're really trying to maintain an early successional community, and we're mowing and we're putting fire in over and over and over. And that feels a little bit more like restoration as opposed to rewilding.
And so do you have thoughts, Markelle, on this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about. I was reflecting on another project I did where there was a mill located, like many of our New England mills, located on a river. And, we've since learned that while the mills were located there as a power source at one time, we've since learned that the rivers need to follow their natural course, and that it's actually not great to have a hardened bank. And so really, I think we've learned a lot along the way, which means going back to sort of correct where we've developed makes a lot of sense in some, not in all cases, but in some cases.
That's interesting. So we have a Russ Cohn's on, and he's made a couple of comments in the Q&A box, which I really appreciate. He found some references to rewilding and some work in Maine, and then Kripalu, the Kripalu yoga retreat has a whole rewilding outdoor thing going. And but he also asks about Coles Brook and the dam in Coles Brook. And he seemed to recall we were thinking about removing the dam, and there was some local objection to it. And, is that still in the works, he asks. And so maybe Karen, you can speak to that.
Yeah, we are not currently removing that dam on the Weiss Tract. But, eventually the dam is getting, it's disintegrating gradually. So it may not be safe at some time in the future, and we'll have to consider that. We are removing a dam on another property in the Southern Berkshires that's got some very bad cracks. It's rewilding a small stream in the Southern Berkshires.
So there is a legacy of a lot of dams on our rivers and tributaries and every little stream, and it's going to take a long time to rewild. And we do see, if we have one of our scientific experts, Allison Bowden, works on bringing back river herring, and it's made such a big difference removing dams. And so I know a lot of the folks on this video are really familiar with how rewilding our rivers pay dividends very quickly. What's interesting to me, though, is people love the nature around them, and the dam creates a swimming hole, or it creates a different kind of fishing opportunity. And so it's curious that there's often local resistance to removing a dam because they love what has happened to nature around the dam. And I don't know if either of you can speak to this, kind of how do we resolve these things? We love what we've got, we have cultural ties to it or whatever, an emotional tie, and rewilding is something different.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that given the number of dams in Massachusetts, there's probably, we can go both ways. And there's maybe some places where we keep them for recreational and other uses, and there's some places where it really makes sense to take them out and let things rewild. It's also very expensive to maintain a dam, so you need to have those resources, and most conservation groups don't have it in their mission and have the resources to maintain dams.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions about this particular rewilding project. One is like, where did the idea come from for it? And then, are we seeing results yet? Do we have any pictures of what the site looks like now, or how long do you think it'll take before, the evidence of the house is really gone? Will it ever?
Yeah, I can speak a little to what, we didn't go into this project thinking that this was going to be the outcome necessarily. So, when we're evaluating land protection projects, we're looking at, we're considering the impacts on all sorts of things, but mostly, we look at ecological function. And this one just had that house so far back in on such a long driveway that it really seemed to compromise. When we looked at the biomap 2 habitat value, and we put, look at overall climate resilience, it really, envisioning sort of, you kind of have to go to the worst place scenario in your head, like somebody paves a huge driveway and puts in a giant house, or whatever, or with a big lawn, or, and what would that mean for our preserve? And so we kind of ended up at that as like, this makes the most sense in this case. But there's also many times we go in and we make decisions because, of property tax implications for towns, that we're not in the business of taking land off the tax rolls, that we really are just wanting to preserve those places of highest ecological value. So this wasn't something we had planned, I think. Is that safe to say, Karen, at the outset? We weren't really planning on it, but we got there, and and thanks to the generosity, which I think someone else mentioned here in the chat, of Roy and Susan, whose story they were nice enough to let us tell, and who've been so gracious to work with this whole project.
I want to do a shout out to Kirsty Bryan, who sent a message in the chat. She said, "I'm the niece of Roy Bryan and very proud of him and Susan for their open hearts and donation. I know this home and land meant very much to him." And that really impressed me too. It's like these folks obviously loved this spot, and I had a kind of a weird feeling seeing them take down a perfectly good house that looked like a good house. So it is a pretty radical step to say, you know what, this might be a nice house in a perfect place, but there's so much value to bringing back the wild. And I really also like, Karen, when you talked about rewilding is about cores, corridors, and carnivores. I like the alliteration, of course, is great, but that idea that it's about connection. It's about protecting the cores, right? That's what we do at TNC. We've got all these forest cores we've protected, but then now we're thinking about how do we connect these landscapes so that there can be a migration of species and the movement of natural movement. But then carnivores, that's kind of interesting that we also need those apex predators and get the ecosystem back to what it would be in nature. And there was an interesting question from Lucian Vasquez, who asked, might the prospect of rewilding be usefully applied in urban and suburban settings? So I just, talked about the rural where it's easy to do, where fragmented semi-forested properties could be transformed into relatively sizable preserves for public usage and nature. And has this happened anywhere already?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in this. There's groups that are interested in making sure that all of our backyards and urban and suburban systems, contribute something. That when I lived in Boston and I would go birding at Mount Auburn Cemetery, all these amazing birds come through and use that important parcel in the spring. And there's other connections. So I think, and certainly like the High Line in New York City has become a wonderful spot. I wouldn't be surprised if there's insects using it, as well as, providing people with much needed place to connect with nature. So there's a lot of groups working on this with this pollinator pathways and making sure that our habitats, that we have a role to play where we live,
The High Line, if folks haven't been to New York and gone on the High Line, it's an extraordinary experience. It feels like it's a little science fiction-y, like we're in the future. But it is an example of rethinking about our cities. And I would suggest that coming out of COVID, where we've seen the connection between health and nature so vividly, that we have an obligation to think about all of our built communities. How do we bring nature back in some ways? And so I think this is a great conversation to be having. We've got a bunch of questions more, so let me keep going. Sarah O'Neill asks, do we have plans for managing the land? Are there invasives? Will we watch what grows? Is there a standard approach to stewardship? And there's another comment from Sherry Vendetti, who talks about Coles Brook crosses her property on West Hill. Every year she sees invasives taking over more land and having ever greater impact on the environment in the area. How do we manage that within the framework of rewilding? So invasives, can we do anything? Is this a lost cause? Like, how do we think about invasives in the context of rewilding?
Yeah, it is very challenging to manage invasives on the large scale. So our approach is to pick the most important places to manage invasives on our properties and focus there, and particularly where there's rare species that might be impacted by them. The numbers of, there are invasive species out in Coles Brook, but it's fairly low concentration compared to some other places we work, particularly in the Southern Berkshires. And so right now our efforts are mostly focused there with, ideally we would also work in Coles Brook and take out early infestations, because that's a real strategy with invasives, like try to keep clean make clean places that are already in pretty good shape. But Coles Brook is 1,500 acres. So it's not an insignificant task to survey and to take out invasives, but certainly we would like to.
Yeah. Linda Clark put in the chat, are you familiar with Grow Native Massachusetts? The work of Doug Tallamy, I guess he's with Grow Native, has done much to get people to recognize what we all can do. And I would say that one of the things we could all do is when we're bringing plants into our gardens, let's make sure they're native. And because that's where a lot of, the biggest problem started as plants we brought into gardens because we liked the way they looked, and then they outcompeted and spread and took over. Any comments from those of you who really know more about this than I do?
One of the nice things about this project, so I think I mentioned that Susan had a cut flower farm, and she really was committed or is committed to native plants. And so they nicely offered, Susan offered for us to come in and salvage some of those plants. So we had a few, staff went in and we did some digging and transplanted some of those native plants in our own gardens. And it was just their spirit of sort of recycling and salvaging was really great. And it is, the Westfield River watershed is some of the least invaded parts of Massachusetts. It's, in part because it's minimally fragmented by roads. And so there's just not the vectors for those invasives to seed and spread. But it's always that getting on top of the next one, right, Karen? Predicting which is the next to invade. That's the challenge.
Nick Long asks an interesting question that I hadn't thought of before, but makes good sense. He says, it seems that the legacies of historical land use can be really helpful in planning restoration and rewilding. Are there resources that are helpful for learning about the histories of your properties? And is that something we do as a practical matter, Karen and Markelle? Do we think about the history as we're looking at restoration and rewilding?
I think we would like to, but there is a lot of information about the history of New England, and what you can see the evidence on the land. Like at Coles Brook, there's 2 foundations, there's stone walls, and so there's you also you can kind of go out there and read the landscape. Is there barbed wire? Is there mounds and dips in the forest? There's a wonderful book that helps people figure out what's happened on their land. And so certainly at Coles Brook, we're not managing it much other than making sure that our boundaries are not encroached by neighbors. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to take out this parcel. So you want to reduce the amount of edge to any property, because then, other people may use your property for dumping or use your other things. So that's the main focus at a place like Coles Brook. It's supposed to be forest that's going to turn into old growth. So, we don't have great plans. But certainly, the places like Harvard Forest have done a lot of work on, what's happened in New England in the past. And that's been, helpful in managing some of our properties, particularly like out on the islands.
So it sounds like rewilding doesn't mean going back to some historic, idealized, condition, but to allow the wild to come back, into the existing land. And if we think about the history of land use in New England, there was a bunch of, deforestation events, right? The sheep, everyone cut down all the trees to farm sheep, and then it grew back, and then they cut it down for dairy. And there are spots on the landscape that have missed part of it, some old growth, but not a lot of old growth. Although Massachusetts has a nice chunk of the bigger trees, which are providing so many carbon benefits right now. But so if we're going back to truly wild, it might be, back to thinking about when it was tribes here and not the Westerners. And it's kind of interesting to think about it. And so when we're thinking about the reference point to wild, we're really saying, hey, let's let nature do its thing. That's kind of my question to the experts, is that rather than saying, hey, there used to be oaks, let's replant some oaks, or,
Yeah, in this particular place, we're not doing forestry projects or planting. There's not fields that we're trying to reforest. So we're kind of letting things take its course, although, there are concerns like the invasive species or forest pests and pathogens. What happens if something comes in and takes out another, large forest tree?
Yeah.
But we'll kind of have to take that as it comes. We've certainly got quite a lot of management on several of our preserves, and less so here.
I think that the history of the land ownership in Coles Brook is people have been really good stewards over time. So the forests have a mixture of species and of ages. They're all aged multi-species stands. So if there is going to be when there is a next infestation, or they are hopefully pretty resilient, to that, just because they've been well managed over time. And there are little pockets next to Coles Brook of these giant hemlocks that have never been touched. Some of these places, the places that are hard to access, of course, you see those big trees.
Yeah, we had a bunch of comments about invasives and natives, and Leslie Casey notes that natives support native insects, especially caterpillars that are essential food for nesting birds. And then Bill Muma, our own, he's one of our treasured trustees. Thanks for being with us, Bill. Noted, and he's an expert, by the way, an international expert on forests. He noted that recent forest harvests often lead to massive invasion of barberry, multiflora rose, and other plants. I recently hiked on an area that is recovering, and the lower story is entirely barberry. How can we deal with this when we rewild these areas? That is a good question. I don't know, do we have a magic answer to that, Karen?
Yeah, we, in the Southern Berkshires for 10 years, we worked on a 20,000 acre scale to take out invasives in those forests, again, because that's those places, like down in Mount Washington and Sheffield, and there's a lot more invasives, and we were trying to get a handle on that. But that was a big project over many years and hard to maintain. But we did try at that scale at one point.
Yeah, there's no easy answer in my experience, right? And every every invasive has, every plant has its own, strengths and and strategies for continuing to dominate. And so yeah, it's a challenge. Vincent DeForno notes, as a member of NEP RWA, we've had issues with removing the old Baker chocolate dam due to soil pollution. And is that a problem with dam removal, toxics in the soils? And, I would assume that's a complication with dams that were used, in industrial areas and more industrialized areas where there could be PCBs and contaminated soils.
Yeah, even if we almost, at the dam we're removing in Mount Washington, we also had to consider that. It was highly unlikely in that setting, but any dam removals that have been in an urban setting, they need to test for that.
Yeah. Tom Webb makes a really good point vis-a-vis our prior conversation. He said, we can't go back to some previous ecological state because of climate change, which is true, right? It's a different world now. But we can let nature do its thing. And so that's what we're attempting out in Coles Brook, is to let nature do its thing and help it out just a little bit. Sarah Parmenter asks, is this a good wildlife corridor, and are the apex predators somewhat sensibly protected from trappers? yeah, what are the apex predators that rewilding, that we'll see when we feel like it's been successfully rewilded?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still, this is a really important, we know, having done a bunch of research in this area, that this is a really important wildlife corridor. There are already, I think, a lot of apex predators there, although they've, yeah, I was reflecting too on just population as part of that too, just rewilding, because there's so many people. So and so much development. But yeah, I would say that this regionally, that that zoom out that we showed, that corridor is just, it's green and it's really critical. But as far as apex predators, like Karen, what would you say? Bear and
Coyote and
yeah,
bobcat and foxes. I mean, we're certainly not going to have wolves probably anytime soon. Or
although some of the coyotes have some genetic wolf in them.
Yes.
So in some ways we do have a little wolf.
Maybe the mountain lion is a chance at some point. One made it all the way to Connecticut at one point.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. We got a number of different questions and concerns about, well, what happens to all the debris? Like, how do we, are we just landfilling all of that? And, are we recycling, because that, I thought that when we were taking this down, it's like, first of all, this is a perfectly good house we're destroying. And what about all that garbage we're creating? Did we have a plan around it to, and as we do it in the future, are we thinking about recycling and keeping
we offered it up to many people, more parts of the house, but as you know, sometimes it's easier to use newer materials. So while some, there was a wonderful iron staircase that someone took, and the greenhouse got recycled or reused. We were not able, and that was a byproduct of the project that is disappointing. I'm hoping that not having a house there is sort of for the greater good. But some of it definitely got landfilled, I'm sure.
And then, but some parts of the house, people really did, some fixtures and things like that. All of that got
screens. Some screens were taken, and interior things.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. So that is the tension. This is Mary Pelletier's question. So there's always this tension of, is there a way to do it with less waste at the end? And
right.
Jonathan Quinn suggested, well, why not remove all the hazardous materials and then just burn it? How would that compare to putting it all in the landfill? And burning it, of course, puts the carbon in the atmosphere right away. The landfill takes longer, and then it's methane. So I don't know if there's a carbon answer to that question. But Kimberly Denton notes, it's great to hear about the rewilding project for this beautiful property. And she's been learning about significant rewilding projects in Europe also. Are there proactive planning considerations within towns in Massachusetts before they start new development projects? Because that's a good way to say, hey, don't take down these trees for a development. Let's think about making sure there's wild space.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing I know to proactive planning is towns, many towns in Massachusetts draft open space and recreation plans. And as part of that, they identify the places that are the most important to preserve and protect, and that are the most ecologically valuable. So my town just got done with doing our update to our plan, and it's great because it really does indicate where development should go and where the town is interested. And we got a lot of public input, so it's not just it's all the residents coming together and saying, this is what we think, these are the places we want to see conserved. This is so not all towns have an open space plan, but many of them do, and it's a great way to get the town involved and engaged in thinking about that proactively siting.
And if you haven't thought about this before, Municipal Vulnerability Program gives money, planning money to towns where you think about where are you vulnerable to climate change and what's a plan for addressing it. And we know we have evidence that that nature can play a really important role in protecting communities from flooding, from heat, from many, sea level rise, from many of the challenges of climate change. And rewilding, certainly can be part of that solution. So there's money for the plan, there's money for some implementation as well. And we're happy to help if it's something that you haven't done yet in your town and you want to get involved. There was a question also about collaboration. Do we collaborate significantly with other TNC chapters in the region? This person's particularly interested in connections with the New Hampshire chapter, if there's one, and we know there are folks here connected to Maine and others. And the answer is yes. At TNC, one of the reasons I love TNC and think we're so powerful in as an organization getting things done is we think at the scale of nature. And for us, it's thinking the Appalachians from, the Blue Ridge all the way up to the boreal forest. And we're also thinking about New England and how do things connect through New England. And so when we're thinking about rivers, when we're thinking about conservation and wildlife migration and climate change, we're thinking all together. And we actually meet as a division. I meet with my colleagues, Markelle and Karen meet with their colleagues. So we're always thinking at this, we say at the scale of nature, right? Nature doesn't stop at the border. So we're thinking beyond it. And there's a lot of exciting regional work going on right now. And, stay tuned, you're going to hear more about it as time goes on. Let's see, I think we have time for just another couple questions. This has been a great conversation. Thank you all. And let me just look in, and I apologize if you've put questions in the chat and I haven't quite gotten to them yet because we had a lot of questions. Let's see. Stephen Jones says he agrees that rewilding ourselves is an attractive and motivating concept that is a challenge to actually accomplish. Would you all agree with that? I think we're a little bit luckier here in Massachusetts, and that there's so many great natural areas to go out in, and getting outside. This concept of forest bathing, I think, has been really cool. The idea that going into nature provides health benefits and makes us feel better and more connected. And I don't know if you read the article in the New York Times last week about the words of our moment, like this languishing, and anyway, that, at the end of the pandemic, even though there's so much hope and we're heading outside and we're getting vaccinated, we're still feeling a little lost. And for me, getting into nature, rewilding my heart or something is really, for me, the cure. And I don't do it enough. I don't know about both of you.
I'm lucky enough to live in a place where I walk every day. And Steve, I will take you with me one day. Steve lives in my community. So I will rewild you, but we get out daily. It's wonderful.
So Russ Cohn asks about, really the big deal here, which is, we've got a lot of development, about connecting corridors to facilitate the movement of wildlife. As we know, in the hill towns and Berkshires, a major barrier to north-south movement is the Massachusetts Turnpike. Are we thinking about ways to mitigate this barrier, like putting in wildlife tunnels or wildlife bridges over the pike? And, is that something we are involved with now or have been involved with?
Yeah, we've done a little bit of, or a lot, my colleague Laura Marks has done a lot of research on how much of a barrier the pike is to wildlife movement, and has put a bunch of wildlife cameras and in culverts underneath to see what is actually making it across. And one thing that they found is it's really important to have protected land on each side, like, of a road crossing, and especially a place like the pike. So that connectivity is hampered, though I think we were surprised that it wasn't quite as hampered as we thought it might be by the pike. So while the pike is a barrier, it's really exciting to think about like an overpass or something that would be wildlife friendly, and that's how cool would that be? And it's been done in other in Canada and other parts of our country, but yeah, it hasn't, we're impressed at the number of wildlife who make it across, and but roads are certainly a barrier, and we're working with Mass DOT on how to, prioritize that kind of protection around those road crossings. And we have a great analysis showing which are the most important crossings to work on.
And that sets us up well for hopefully an infrastructure bill that gets passed that brings dollars in back to the states to upgrade infrastructure. And so we're ready to go. So, definitely talk to your local legislators, because we want, nature to be on the menu of things we're, going to be focusing on with that money and supporting. So look, we're reaching the end of our time. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share? Maybe starting with Karen, and we'll let Markelle finish up.
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasize, I think that we all can contribute, at whatever scale, from your lawn, getting rid of your lawn, to working with pollinator initiatives, to working with your town's open space plan, to supporting groups that are working regionally. I think it's something that we can empower ourselves to do.
That's great. And Markelle?
Yeah, I so appreciate the power of partnerships and of people on the ground getting things done. And I've been excited to see how many people are using nature as refuge right now during the pandemic. It's really amazing to have these places to go. So I feel like we're at a critical point in time here where we can do even more. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that all of you are involved and continue to do the important work you do.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate your support for the Nature Conservancy. It is your support that makes all of this work possible. We're going to be sending you a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today, and also a recording of the webinar. And if you're enjoying our webinars, please feel free to share them with your friends and family. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. And as always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. I want to thank you all again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you again, Karen and Markelle. You're fabulous, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.